So our first guests are Guido, Bonino and Paolo Tripodi from the University of Turin, and they are going to tell us something about Sellars and Wittgenstein, early and late. Thank you.
First of all, we would like to thank the organizers of this conference, at least for two reasons. First is for having had the idea of this conference, and then for having invited us. Antonio has already talked about the famous passage in Science and Metaphysics in which Sellars spoke of the history of philosophy as the lingua franca of philosophy. In this passage, Sellars says that this lingua franca is to be used as a means of communication among philosophers, though not only as a means of communication. But there is another significant passage concerning this issue, drawn from Sellars' autobiographical reflections, which is somewhat more personal. In this passage, Sellars is telling us the story of how he came to write Realism and the New Way of Words in 1948, after several years of mainly silent reflections. This is the quotation: "At last I had found a successful strategy for writing. I soon discovered that spinning out, as I was, ideas in a vacuum, everything I wrote was idiosyncratic and had little direct connection with what others had said. Each spinning required a new web to support it, and the search for fixed points of reference became a struggle for coherence and completeness. I soon came to see that a dialectical use of historical positions is the most reliable way of anchoring arguments and making them intersubjectively available. In the limiting case, this use of history is illustrated by correspondence and controversial exchanges with contemporaries." In what follows, we would like to examine whether this idea of the history of philosophy as a means of communication can be actually seen at work in Sellars' dealings with a specific philosopher. And since Sellars said that of means of communication is not the only use of the history of philosophy, we are also going to investigate the other possible uses. The specific philosopher we chose for this inquiry is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, Wittgenstein's case is especially interesting for reasons that pertain both to Wittgenstein's side and to Sellars' side. On Wittgenstein's side, the interesting point is the rather obvious one that there are at least two clearly distinguishable Wittgensteins, the early, the Tractatus, and the late Wittgenstein. On Sellars' side, the interesting point is that Sellars wants to use both Wittgensteins. Now, those who use Wittgensteinian themes for their own philosophical purposes usually choose only one of the two Wittgensteins. And on the other hand, those philosophers or scholars who are interested in Wittgenstein from a historical philosophical point of view often focus on the continuity-discontinuity issue, the continuity-discontinuity between the two phases of Wittgenstein's philosophy. Well, Sellars' case cannot be easily classified in this way according to the usual categories. Sellars wants to use both Wittgensteins and for philosophical purposes. From a philosophical point of view, that raises at least two questions. The first is, does it work? That is such a combination of motives coming both from the early and the late Wittgenstein philosophically tenable? And the second is, are the uses or motives coming from the early and the late Wittgenstein in some way connected or correlated with Sellars' famous distinction between the scientific and the manifest image of the world? Other questions may be asked from a historical philosophical perspective, that is, from a perspective that focuses on exegetical issues as well as on the more general assessment of Wittgenstein's place and role in the history of philosophy. Among these questions are, what are Sellars' interpretations of the philosophies of the early and the late Wittgenstein respectively? what is Sellars' view concerning the continuity-discontinuity issue? But our main question is another, and is the following. How does Sellars make the two Wittgensteins interact with each other? Our guess is that it is in these modes of interaction, these ways of interacting, that the originality of Sellars' approach is most clearly apparent. And now I can leave.
Okay. Now, we start from the part of the talk on Sellars and the later Wittgenstein. Okay, there are several themes that Sellars share with the later Wittgenstein. For example, anti-foundationalism in epistemology, anti-Cartesianism in philosophy of mind, and the idea that the normative dimension cannot be reduced in naturalistic terms, and also some meta-philosophical themes. However, among all such themes, we chose one in this talk, that is one taken from the philosophy of language, and in particular the conception of semantics. Okay, in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, Sellars makes clear that there is a strict connection between the myth of the given, that is his main polemical target in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, and certain conceptions of language. Roughly, the myth of the given is the idea that any knowledge we may have is ultimately based on some non-inferential immediate knowledge of basic, self-justified, and epistemically independent elements. So, the link with the conception of language, the first link Sellars makes is the following. One way to avoid the myth of the given is to understand that psychological nominalism is true. That is that, I quote, all awareness of sorts, resemblance, facts, etc., in short, all awareness of abstract entities, indeed all awareness even of particulars, is a linguistic affair. Symmetrically, one could say that a form of the myth of the given, a possible formulation of the myth of the given, is the idea that some awareness of abstract entities or indeed of particulars is pre-linguistic. And Sellars suggests in particular that a possible formulation of the myth of the given is, a possible formulation concerns the topic of the acquisition of language. I quote from section 31 of Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind. The myth of the given can be formulated as a thesis concerning language acquisition, that is, as the thesis that there is awareness of logical space prior to or independent of the acquisition of a language. Okay, and here Sellars explicitly refers to the later Wittgenstein, and in particular to the first sections of the philosophical investigations where Wittgenstein criticized the so-called Augustinian picture of language. The Augustinian picture of meaning is the idea that every word has a meaning, and this meaning is correlated to the word, and the meaning of a word is the object it stands for, and the essential function of language is naming. Sellars provides us with a formulation of the Augustinian picture of language acquisition, which according to him is strictly correlated to the myth of the given formulated as a thesis on language acquisition. Here is the quotation. The process of teaching a child to use a language is that of teaching it to discriminate elements within a logical space of particulars, universal facts, etc., of which it is already undiscriminately aware, and to associate these discriminated elements with verbal symbols. According to Sellars, the Augustinian picture of language acquisition is a especially tempting form of the myth of the given because it is a source of the myth of the given to which even philosophers who are suspicious of the whole idea of inner episode can fall prey, and even nominalists, that is, those according to which there are only particulars, can fall prey to it. This is why Sellars suggests that a real test for a theory of language is its account of thinking in presence rather than of thinking in absence. These are expressions taken by H.H. Price, but the idea of thinking in presence is a situation where the alleged meaning of a word is there in front of us, okay? The reference to Wittgenstein is explicit not only because it is describing the Augustinian picture of meaning, but also because at one point Sellars says a child or someone who carries slabs. Okay, so he's clearly indicating the philosophical investigations. However, Sellars thinks that one typical form of the Augustinian picture of meaning is the idea that the meaning is not the object there, but is an abstract entity. In particular, the meaning of a predicate is the abstract entity the predicate stands for. For example, the word red means that it designates the quality or the property red. According to Sellars, this view of meaning depends on the idea that the word red would not be the predicate it is if it didn't have the logical syntax characteristics of predicates, but also it would not be the predicate it is unless we tended to respond to red things in standard circumstances with something having the force of this is red in a similar way as that in which a thermometer tends to respond to a certain temperature by something having the force of, say, 36 degrees. However, Sellars thinks that these two claims are important, but there is one main argument for the Augustinian picture of meaning in this Platonist form, conceived of this idea that the meaning is the abstract entity. And the main argument is what Sellars call the relational conception of means. The relational conception of these, in quote, means that. Sellars thinks that this conception is based on a superficial analogy. I quote, "Since the statement in German rot means red superficially resembles such relational statements as Coley adjoins Oxford, then we can assimilate the form these, in quotes, means that to the form eggs are y." And this invites us to take for granted that meaning is a relation between a word and a nonverbal entity, and to suppose that the relation in question is that of association. Okay. According to Sellars, the analogy, the superficial analogy, is misleading, and in fact, a less misleading picture of meaning is a different one. And here is the way in which he put things in empiricism and the philosophy of mind. I quote, "The truth of the matter, of course, is that statements of the form these, in quote, means that are not relational statements. The rubric means is a linguistic device for conveying the rubric these, in quote, means that is a linguistic device for conveying the information that a mentioned word, in this case rot, plays the same role in a certain linguistic economy, in this case the linguistic economy of German-speaking peoples, as does the word red, which is not mentioned but used in a unique way, exhibited, so to speak, and which occurs on the right-hand side of the semantical statements. Take, for example, the word und rather than the word red. Here, according to Sellars, it's clear that the meaning of und is not the Platonic entity designed, meant or named by the word und, but rather is the inferential role of the connective. Okay, as is well known, Sellars introduces the so-called dot quoting device in order to express his functional role semantics. And all of you knows very well what this is, so I just say it in a few words. Take, for example, the Augustinian, or as we will see, Tarskian-Carnappian formulation of the semantical statements such as rouge in French means red, this, according to Sellars, this semantical statement should be replaced by a less misleading formulation. For example, rouge in French means dot red dot, or better, rouge in French is a dot red dot, which means something like rouge in French plays the same role that red plays in English. Okay, notice that here it seems that there is a prima facie consequence, namely that semantics seems to be entirely intralinguistic. Okay, after empiricism and the philosophy of mind, Sellars often associates his functional role semantics to the later Wittgenstein, and especially to the later Wittgensteinian slogan that meaning can be seen as use. There are several quotations, several possible quotations, but I just read one that occurs in many different places. According to this analysis, Sellars says, meaning is not a relation for the very simple reason that means is a specialized form of the copula. Again, the meaning of an expression is its use in the sense of function, in that to say what an expression means is to classify it by means of an illustrating functional sortal. Okay, but what about Sellars presenting his role functional semantics before empiricism and philosophy of mind? Now, what I would like to say, what we would like to say is that initially, I mean, for example, in his 1948 papers, Realism and the New Way of Words, or Epistemology and the New Way of Words, Sellars introduced a somewhat less mature or crude version of the role functional semantics, but he was not above all concerned with Wittgenstein, but rather he was trying to discuss, develop, and criticize Carnap's 1942 semantics, Carnap's attempt to provide a semantics in his Introduction to Semantics. Carnap's semantics is seen by Sellars as the paradigmatic case of relational semantics. Okay, and we would like to underline that more or less in 1953, but probably in 1954, with the publication of some reflections on language games, Sellars starts to use the later Wittgensteinian vocabulary to express this same role functional semantics. More precisely, Sellars introduces this terminology, a terminology made of concepts such as rule, rule-governed activity, grammar, use, and so forth. He introduces this terminology in a somewhat gradual way, but from 1953-1954, the reference to Wittgenstein is made more explicit, and the terminology becomes more and more dominant. Okay. Now, we have seen above that a prima facie consequence of Sellars' functional role semantics is the view that within semantics, apparently we do not reach out to the word. To this prima facie consequence, one might object that this is not true, because in many places, for instance, in some reflections on language games, but also elsewhere, Sellars says that functional roles involve not only intralinguistic moves, but also what he calls language entry transitions. For example, I see a red thing in front of me and I say, this is red, and also what he calls language exit or departure transitions. For example, I say, I shall catch a red thing and stretch out my arm toward a red thing in front of me. Okay. However, to the very question, is the idea that there are also language entry and exit transitions, is that idea enough to guarantee a language-to-word grounding? And it's an interesting thing. We think that Sellars' own answer is no. There are here also several possible quotations, but I read one from Is There a Synthetic A Priori? I quote, just as an intralinguistic move is not in the full sense an inference unless the subject not only conforms to but follows syntactical rules, so a language entry transition is not in the full sense an observation unless the subject not only in normal circumstances tokens this object is green, if and only if a green object is present to his senses, but is able to infer in a pragmatic meta-language from John's uttered this object is green at time t in place S in circumstance C to a green object was present to John's senses at t in S. So the point is that such behavioral moves and transitions, entry and exit transitions, are nothing but conditioned responses and do not involve any semantic or normative connection between language and the word. So in this sense, semantics proper is entirely intralinguistic. On the one hand, Sellars thinks that his main preoccupation should be that we do not acquire the meaning of a word such as red by obeying semantical rules such as red objects are to be called red, and this is the main preoccupation because this idea suggests that, or presupposes that there are pre-linguistic concepts. That is, as we have seen, this is a form of the myth of the given. On the other hand, Sellars thinks that his own raw functional semantics, a view that avoids the myth of the given, has a possible shortcoming. That is, the problem of linguistic idealism, the problem that within semantics we never reach out to the word.
Linguistic idealism is explicitly addressed as a problem in Sellars' paper Truth and Correspondence, published in 1962. And this problem is addressed by both interpreting and using the Tractatus, or better, by using some suggestions drawn from the Tractatus as the Tractatus is interpreted by Sellars. And the Tractatus, according to Sellars, needs an interpretation, and needs an interpretation that is in accordance with Sellars' own conception of semantics. And that is because if you accept a Tarski-Carnap style semantics, a relational view of semantics, the Tractatus itself turns out to be incoherent. Let us consider the semantical statement 1, S in L means A or B. Now, according to the Tractatus doctrine, a statement or a sentence can occur within another sentence only truth functionally. But in S in L means A or B occurs in a non-truth functional way. Therefore, semantical statements such as 1 are, strictly speaking, unsayable. Of course, this is the famous thesis of the ineffability of semantics, but according to Sellars, this thesis is paradoxical and unacceptable result, which means the whole Tractatus in some way paradoxical or incoherent. Now, the paradox of S in L means A or B, according to Sellars, can be solved if either condition 1 or 2 is satisfied. Now, condition 1 is that A or B does not really occur in S in L means A or B, so that if it does not occur in 1, there is not the problem of its not occurring truth functionally, so to speak. And the second condition is that 1, S in L means A or B, is not a statement proper, as Sellars says. That is, it is not a Wittgensteinian Satz, or a declarative sentence that may be true or false with reference, may be true or false in that it describes a matter of fact. Now, Sellars' idea is that both conditions 1 and 2 are satisfied if one adopts Sellars' functional role semantics. The first condition is satisfied because S in L means A or B is to be reinterpreted, according to Sellars' view of semantics, as S in L plays the same role as ARB within quotes. What occurs here is not ARB, but rather the name of ARB. In a way, ARB is mentioned, or as Sellars says, it occurs only indirectly. To show that the second condition is also satisfied, it is easier to use a different example of semantical statement, and that is exactly how Sellars himself proceeds. The semantical statements that are taken into consideration are those in which the notion of truth is involved. Now, according to the Tarski-Carnap semantics, or Sellars' view of the Tarski-Carnap semantics, this is the way in which the notion of truth is in which the predicate is true is defined. The definition from Carnap is Chicago est grande in French is true if and only if there is a P such that Chicago est grande in French means P and P. Now, according to Sellars' view of semantics, this formula has to be modified in the following way to get this other formula, which is Chicago est grande in French is true if and only if there is a that P such that Chicago est grande in French expresses the proposition that P and that P is true. Where the phrase expresses the proposition that P is equivalent to is a dot, Chicago is large dot, which in its turn must be understood as plays the same role played in English by Chicago is large. As is it easy to see, also in this case, semantics is entirely intralinguistic. But now, the crucial question to be answered is what do statements such as that Chicago is large is true, that is the second conjunct of the right-hand side of the formula, what do statements such that Chicago is large is true mean? Now, Sellars' formula, Chicago grande in French is true if and only if there is a that P such that Chicago grande in French expresses the proposition that P and that P is true, cannot be regarded as a statement providing a genuine definition of the predicate is true, since such a predicate occurs both on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side of the formula. Thus, a more revealing way to answer the question, what does that Chicago is large is true mean, according to Sellars, is that Chicago is large is true entails and is entailed by Chicago is large. This is to be understood as a principle of inference, is a rule that warrants us to do something with language, because inferring is a doing, as Sellars says. This view, according to which the meaning of true is entirely captured by such rules of inference, finds confirmation in science and metaphysics, where Sellars speaks of truth as assertibility. Now, there are some morals to be drawn here. The first remark is that in this way it has been shown that semantical statements are to be understood as rules, therefore not as statements proper in the sense of the Tractatus, and this also for examples such as the original semantical statement S in L means A or B. So, in this way, also condition 2 is satisfied. Semantical statements such as this one are not statements proper, is not a statement proper, as Sellars says. Therefore, the ineffability problem is solved. It is doubly solved, so to speak, because condition 1 is satisfied, also condition 2 is satisfied. And the Tractatus is coherent. Second remark, the case of semantical statements involving truth shows once again in what sense semantics, according to Sellars' view, never reaches out to the world. Third remark, it is to be noticed that this intralinguistic dimension, so to speak, cannot be transcended whenever we have to do with propositions or facts. In Sellars' framework, propositions or facts only occur in the context of semantical statements such as those illustrated above, and so only in the contexts of contexts in which there is no way out of the intralinguistic or the linguistic sphere, so to speak. Sellars explicitly recognizes that such a view can be accused of linguistic idealism, and he also explicitly recognizes that this is a problem. But a solution to this problem comes from a suggestion that can be found in the Tractatus itself. Now, the previous characterization of truth, as captured by rules of inference, holds, according to Sellars and according to Sellars' interpretation of the Tractatus, holds for all kinds of truths, from mathematical truths to factual truths. But in the case of factual statements, of matter of factual statements, as Sellars sometimes calls them, there is something more to be taken into account, and this something more is the picture theory. Now, as Sellars interprets the picture theory, the picturing relation is a highly complex relation of projection based on complicated natural regularities and holding between two complex, that is, structured natural objects. Now we have to explain what it means that the terms of the picturing relation are natural and what it means that they are objects, as well as why they must be so. As to natural, the two objects of the picturing relation are on the one hand the linguistic sign, but the linguistic sign in this case must be conceived of as a purely natural object, an item in the order of causes and effects, as Sellars says, in rerum natura. We must abstract for all the normative dimension. And on the other hand, we have, of course, the pictured object in the world as the second term. The reason why both terms must be natural in this sense is that the causal nature of the picturing relation demands natural terms. And then the two terms are objects rather than facts. The pictured complex object is outside of language, but in order for it to be so, it cannot be a fact, since facts or propositions are linguistic entities inhabiting the space of reasons, as we have just seen. On the whole, it should be remarked that the picture theory conceived in this way does not belong to semantics proper. We could summarize the two domains of semantics and picture theory in this way. In semantics, we have formulas such as ARB in L means ARB. This is to be understood according to, of course, Sellars' view of semantics as ARB in L plays the same role played by P or whatever in ML, in the meta-language and the language we are speaking. ARB, with the first occurrence of ARB within quotes, is the name of a meaningful sentence of L. The role of which we have just spoken involves normativity. And the semantical statement as a whole, the ARB in L means ARB, is to be understood as a principle of inference. It should be remarked once more that in the semantic situation, we never go outside the linguistic sphere. In the picture theory, on the other hand, we have formulas such as A are B pictures, A prime, R prime, B prime. These formulas to be understood as A R B is in a certain highly complicated relation or projection with A prime, R prime, B prime. ARB is a complex natural object, a combination of sounds or ink spots or whatever. It is devoid of any normativity. A prime, R prime, B prime is also a complex natural object. For instance, a cat on the table, but not that a cat is on the table, but because that would be a fact. The picture theory statement as a whole is an object language description of a natural regularity. Here it should be remarked that in the picturing situation there is nothing genuinely linguistic. There is nothing involving normativity. It could seem therefore that semantics and picture theory are completely disconnected, so to speak, yet there is, according to Sellars, a connection between them. More exactly, there is a connection between the truth of a statement and the correctness of a picture. The correctness of a picture is not a normative notion. A picture is said to be correct if it is projected in a way that conforms to certain highly complex causal regularities. But now the criterion according to which we decide whether a statement is true is whether the same statement, conceived as a complex object in the order of causes and effects, conceived as a natural complex object, that is to say, is a correct picture. In other words, the statement proper, so to speak, does not say that the picture is correct, but it implies that the picture is correct, since that is the criterion for its truth. Thus, in a somewhat indirect way, a connection between language and the extra-linguistic reality is finally secured. And
now... and now we try to sum up what we have said in this talk and to answer our initial question. How does Sellars make the two Wittgenstein interact with each other? And we hope that this answer says something also on the general topic of the conference on Sellars and the history of philosophy. Okay, now, first of all, we have seen that Sellars used the later Wittgenstein as a lingua franca in a perhaps a slightly different sense than the one presented by Antonio in the introduction, as a lingua franca to say things concerning semantics, things that he himself thought some years before in a different context, namely in the context of discussing, developing, and criticizing Carnap's relational semantics. Okay, here it is interesting to notice that Sellars already knew Wittgenstein's Blue and Brown books, and also Gilbert Ryle's critique of the so-called Fido conception of meaning, which is, in its turn, highly influenced, very much influenced by Wittgenstein's critique to the Augustinian picture of meaning. However, it seems to us that only after the publication of the philosophical investigations, Sellars begins to systematically associate his functional role semantics to later Wittgensteinian terms. It looks as if Sellars found in the later Wittgenstein the useful vocabulary, the lingua franca he was looking for, a vocabulary made of words such as rule, rule-governed activity, grammar use, language game, and so forth. Okay, it seems to us that partly thanks to the use of the later Wittgenstein, Sellars' functional role semantics became clearer and clearer. In this sense, Wittgenstein was a good means of communication for Sellars. And this is very interesting, especially if one realizes that in that period in the US, very few people were able to understand what was going on in the philosophical investigations, let alone to use the philosophical investigations for their philosophical purposes. Okay. Moreover, Sellars' semantics originated, okay, in the ideal dialogue with Carnap and then expressed in later Wittgensteinian terms, as Sellars himself recognized, had some shortcomings, namely the problem of linguistic idealism. Okay, Sellars found a solution to this problem in the Tractatus picture theory. Here, the history of philosophy may be seen as a repository of philosophical tools rather than as a lingua franca, and in particular, the picture theory, drawn from the early Wittgenstein, is a philosophical tool that Sellars employs to solve a problem that arose in the context of a semantics somewhat inspired by the later Wittgenstein. Okay, so he used the Tractatus to solve his philosophical problems, but then the question arises, which Tractatus? And the answer is, well, the Tractatus as Sellars interpreted it. So here we want to underline that Sellars had an independent motivation to provide a novel interpretation to the Tractatus, and the independent motivation is that he found a paradox, a problem in the Tractatus itself, the problem of the ineffability of semantics that made the Tractatus incoherent. Okay, this suggests, according to us, that Sellars oscillates between three options: interpreting the Tractatus for the sake of understanding the early Wittgenstein, interpreting the Tractatus for the sake of solving a philosophical problem he found in the Tractatus itself, that is the problem of the ineffability of semantics, but also a third option, that is interpreting the Tractatus with the purpose of solving a philosophical problem originated outside the Tractatus, in particular, originated in his functional role semantics expressed in later Wittgensteinian terms. Okay, and here we would like to say that an interesting thing is that, according to Sellars, as it should be clear by reading the very first quotation of our talk, the one Guido read from the autobiographical reflections, according to Sellars, such three options should not be regarded as discrete alternatives, but rather they seem to spread along a continuum. Okay, and to conclude, that the way in which Sellars makes the two Wittgenstein interact with each other is a complex and interesting way. It's shown by a further complication. The complication is that, okay, we can see the complication by answering the question, how did Sellars interpret the Tractatus in order to solve the ineffability problem, thus making the Tractatus coherent? And the answer is, well, by using the later Wittgenstein. Or better, by reading the Tractatus on the basis of functional role semantics, partly inspired by the later Wittgenstein, rather than on the basis of a Tarskian-Carnapian semantics. Okay, here you have a schematic representation, or if you like, a diagram of the interesting and complex ways in which, as far as the issue of semantics is concerned, the two Wittgenstein interact in the hands of Sellars. We submit such a diagram to you for further reflections and remarks. Thank you.